because people in the United States might say, you know, why was this time chosen? Well, this coincides with my world religions module that meets at 2 p.m. Irish time. And I just thought it would be really important to get, you know, many of, you could say, the next generation from my standpoint of future teachers, academics, educators, who, to be honest, may not be aware of the treat that they have in store for them. Having somebody with such a wealth, such a breadth and depth of knowledge and information, having somebody who can speak about a role that she played in, among other things, in the Second Vatican Council and Nostra Aetate. I mean, that in itself, it may not hit them till later on when they go, oh, I heard somebody, you know, but this is, of course, what learning is about, even if we don't appreciate it, perhaps, in the moment. So again, wide range of groups, and hopefully we'll hear a bit from each other. There'll be a question and answer session, and the floor will be open. What I might just say for that is, perhaps what you could do is either signal with the little raise the hand little button, if I can call it that, or also use the chat, of course, to maybe write your question down. So you can, you know, do one of those options as we go along. Okay. Again, many of you know Judith. I'm just going to do a bit of a short overview, partly because, look, you reach a point when somebody has such a rich history that if I'm doing the bio and all the things she's accomplished, we'd have no time to listen to her. And again, we're here to listen to her, not to me. But let me just take this quote, and Judith, I'm not going to raise the bar here too high, but you know, it's worth saying, no one has done more to shape the nature and meaning of interreligious relations as we have developed them, perhaps uniquely in this country, meaning the US, than Judith Banki, the National Workshop on Christian-Jewish Relations. So that's no pressure, Judith, right? At all, right? No, I mean, no one has done more. I mean, that's, if you think about all the people who have been involved in this field, and many of them are listening in our audience right now. I mean, that's quite a claim. Again, this is adapted from the Tannenbaum homepage, so I'm only going to read a little bit of it, as I said. Dr. Judith Banki is an internationally renowned writer, lecturer, and expert in interreligious affairs. Her writing and research reports have largely focused on the image of the other in religious education and the sources of prejudice in various teaching and preaching traditions. She has served as the Associate National Director of the Interreligious Affairs for the American Jewish Committee and as editor of the Interreligious Newsletter. In 2001, Dr. Banki received an honorary doctorate from Seton Hall University in recognition of her pioneering work in the areas of Jewish-Christian relations. Again, I'm going to pause here because we can go on further, and I've already given out that I can't do two things at once as more people are trying to get in. So I think it's best I'll start doing that. And Dr. Banki, I'll turn it over to you. And look, it's an honor, it's a privilege, it's a pleasure to have you with us today.
Thank you. Am I unmuted? Yeah, can you hear me? Thank you. I snuck a look out at people who are in the audience today, and I can see about 3 or 4 of them who should be giving this talk. But the only advantage I have is that I'm older and I was actually around at the time. My talk is titled Reflections from an Eyewitness, Nostra Aetate. And I want to begin by quoting another eyewitness, someone much closer to the daily conflicts and crises, excuse me, within the halls of Vatican II than I was. And that's Father Thomas Stransky, who served as a young priest in the Secretariat for the promotion of Christian unity during the Second Vatican Council. And interestingly enough, that is where the so-called Jewish portfolio was housed within the Commission for Christian Unity, not in the Commission for Interreligious Dialogue, in the Commission for Christian Unity. And that's another whole story. But Father Stransky has written, and I quote, "It is impossible to understand modern Catholicism, indeed, modern Protestantism and Eastern Orthodoxy without taking into account Vatican II. I would add that's also impossible to understand the contemporary Jewish community and the broad field of Jewish-Christian relations without taking into account the changes wrought by Vatican II." And then he went on to note that these monumental changes took place before most of today's Catholics and others were born. The documents, he said, quote, stand by themselves without a history. In his words, the texts outlive the contexts. Today, some 60 years later, in terms of my own involvement, I hope to recall some of those contexts. Like Father Stransky, I am a child of the Second Vatican Council. He on the Catholic side, I on the Jewish side. That is, I cut my teeth in the field of Jewish-Christian relations as part of a relatively small group of Jewish activists who mounted an initiative on behalf of an authoritative statement on Jews and Judaism to be adopted at the council. A statement that would condemn anti-Semitism, repudiate the then fairly widespread deicide, God-killing charge against the Jewish people, correct teachings of contempt about Jews and Judaism, acknowledge that Judaism did not end with the emergence of Christianity, but continued to develop as a living faith, and inaugurate an ongoing dialogue between the church and the Jewish community. And we further hope that these policies would be implemented through the establishment of some permanent structure within the church. In other words, an address and a phone number. Like Father Stransky, I look around at the actors in that drama, and believe me, it was a cliffhanger. From the Catholic side, I believe all of the 2,500 bishops who attended the council are gone. When Tom Stransky wrote those words, he said that only he and one consultor remained of the secretariat in which he served. Both of them have passed on now. Tom Stransky died a few years ago, and so did Gregory Baum. On the Jewish side, those active in some sustained fashion on behalf of the so-called Jewish decree, and the Declaration on Religious Liberty, by the way, which was also of concern to Jews and Protestants. But Rabbis Mark Tannenbaum and Abraham Joshua Heschel, Dr. Eric Werner of Hebrew Union College, who drafted the memorandum on anti-Jewish elements in Catholic liturgy, Dr. Joseph Lichten of the Anti-Defamation League, Dr. Gerhard Riegner of the World Jewish Congress, all have passed on. If any of them were still alive, they'd be giving this talk. I remain a somewhat battered veteran of the 50-year-old struggle. And in Father Stransky's poignant words, quote, 50 years later, we remember, misremember, and forget. When John the 23rd was elected to the papacy in 1958, he was considered, I think, by those who elected him to be an interim pope. He was an old man at the time. I'm not sure he wasn't in great health. Pope Pius XII, who had led the church through the dramatic episodes of the Second World War and into the early 50s, into the middle 50s, had been a very powerful pope. He made a lot of, he led the church through a very perilous time, and he made some doctrinal changes, some from our point of view good and some not so good. And I don't think that John the 23rd was expected to be anything but a hold the chair pope until other leadership could be developed. But he surprised everyone by announcing the summoning of an ecumenical council, which is basically a meeting of the board of directors of the Catholic Church. At the time, we at the American Jewish Committee, whose Interreligious Affairs Department was headed up by Rabbi Mark Tannenbaum, who led our initiative vis-a-vis the church. We were approached by a French Catholic author and scholar, Madame Claire Huchet-Bishop, who was an ardent devotee of the work of Jules Isaac, and I'll say a few words about him later. It was she who pressed for the publication of his books in the United States, and thus indirectly for familiarity with the expression, the teaching of contempt on the North American continent. She urged the American Jewish Committee to become involved insofar as possible in the coming council, and to urge the church to confront the anti-Semitic tradition of teaching and preaching, whereby Jews had been segregated, degraded, charged with wicked crimes, and valued only as potential converts. Ecumenical councils are few and far between, she said, and this is a historic opportunity. Seize it. And I should note that the previous Vatican Council, which I think was 1875, I'm not sure, Mary, you can correct me on that, was quite a conservative one. And it declared that the idea of religious liberty was a foolish idea. It accepted the idea of papal infallibility, of course on a limited basis, but still papal infallibility. And it was kind of, I'd say, turned its back on the modern world. And another historic event added urgency to that goal. At the same time that the preparatory commissions for the council were going about their work, the nightmarish details of the Nazi genocide against the Jews were being vividly recalled by the trial of Adolf Eichmann in Jerusalem. A generation after the Shoah, some people learned for the first time that half the Jews of Europe, 1/3 of all of the Jewish people in the world, had died in that Holocaust, most of them deliberately and cruelly murdered. Asian communities of learning and piety were completely decimated, all with the deliberate goal of wiping this people from the face of the earth, erasing from memory its culture, its language, its religious legacy. The moral questions posed by the Eichmann trial were not lost on religious spokesmen, some of whom pointed to the need to root out the sources of hatred and contempt for Jews and Judaism for once and for all. Now, a few words about Jules Isaac, because he played a very important role. For those who may not know his name or his contribution to our time, he was an assimilated, that is not a particularly religious, French Jewish scholar, historian, who had attained the highest position ever achieved by a Jew in France. He was director of higher education in the French civil service. He was in southern France. He lived in southern France for a long time in Aix-en-Provence, and so he was not in the northern part that was occupied by the Germans, but of course the Vichy government was collaborative. And one day he came home and discovered that his wife and children had been arrested by the Gestapo and sent off to a camp. His wife was murdered, and one of his sons escaped. One of his sons was not there when they were arrested. He was hidden out by Christian friends and colleagues, and he devoted the rest of his life to exploring the roots of the poison of anti-Semitism. And he found some of those roots in a long-standing and hostile tradition of Christian teaching and preaching that he brilliantly named the teaching of contempt. And over the years, his books and lectures convinced a number of Christian and Jewish supporters, among them Madam Bishop. And in 1947, after the war, they assembled together in Switzerland, this group. They started what is now the International Council of Christians and Jews, and they came out with a document called the 10 Points of Seelisberg. That's where the conference took place in Seelisberg, Switzerland, which laid out 10 points that Christians should incorporate into their teaching about Jews and Judaism. And when Vatican II was announced, he sought a meeting with Pope John the 23rd to use his own passion and influence to try to get John to back this kind of study and attention to Jewish-Christian relations as part of the council. And he was given that audience. And when he showed up for it, he was told that the Pope was sick or too busy, and they tried to turn him away. And in desperation, he turned, and I have to apologize because I don't know this woman's name. He turned to a Roman Catholic nun who had some kind of position inside the halls of the Vatican, and she got him through. And the two men came together for what was to have been a 10-minute audience. It lasted, I think, for 30 or 40 minutes. And during it, Isaac made his point that it was time for the church to look into what it taught about Jews and Judaism and to establish an ongoing relationship of friendship and dialogue. And the Pope assured him that that it was also his wish. So, in retrospect, somebody did a documentary called The Two Popes. They ought to do a documentary about Isaac and John the 23rd, because these were two elderly men, not in good health. Neither of them survived the passage of Nostra Aetate. Pope John the 23rd died in 63. I'm not sure when Isaac died, but both of them died within a few years after their interview, but they changed the course of Catholic Jewish history. And that's not belittling what we did in the United States and our own efforts, but Isaac was a major influence and he should be acknowledged. It soon became known, and so the Pope gave that a responsibility to Cardinal Augustin Bea, who was himself a German biblical scholar. And it soon got around that he was a key figure with regard to the Jewish decree, the so-called Jewish decree, that's what it was called at the time, at Vatican II, and that he and his secretariat had been entrusted by Pope John to draft a statement and to seek representative Jewish viewpoints. So the way was open for communication, and we at the American Jewish Committee jumped in with both feet. On July 31st, 1961, a year before the opening of the Council's first session, we submitted to Cardinal Bea, by prior agreement, that is with his invitation, the first of several comprehensive memoranda. It was titled The Image of the Jew in Catholic Teaching. It was a 32-page document which identified and illustrated slanderous interpretations, oversimplifications, unjust or inaccurate comparisons, invidious use of language, and significant omissions in American Catholic textbooks, and it cited existing Catholic sources that could serve as corrections. I'm the author of that document, and therein lies the story. When I came to the American Jewish Committee late in 1959, I was assigned an intriguing task to assess, summarize, and circulate the findings of self-studies of Protestant Catholic and Jewish religious textbooks stimulated by the AJC. That Jews should be concerned about how Christians depicted them should not surprise anyone. The Jews were convinced that a certain tradition of Christian teaching and preaching represented one of the primary sources of anti-Semitism across the centuries. Still, it should be stressed that these were self-studies in which the religious education materials of a particular religious community were examined by a scholar from within that community and faithful to its values and vision. And the Protestant self-studies were conducted at Yale Divinity School by a Methodist scholar named Bernhard Olson from 1952 to 1959, and eventually published by Yale University Press, as he did it at Yale Divinity School, and it was called Faith and Prejudice. The Catholic studies were carried out at St. Louis University, a Jesuit institution. And there were 3 teaching nuns, 3 teaching sisters that examined different aspects of the textbooks. And I confess I don't remember the names of all 3. One of them examined a Catholic social studies textbooks and one Catholic literature textbooks. And both of those were not problematic. They were very similar to these secular materials on social studies and literature. And of course, the pay dirt, and it was the last to be done and the most sensitive, were religion and church history textbooks and teachers' manuals. And they were examined by Sister Rose Thiering, a Dominican nun from Racine, Wisconsin. I thought that the negativity with which some of her findings were received only strengthened her backbone and made her more courageous. But I was told by one of her sisters at the home convent that she was actually terribly distraught by it and even considered not completing the study. But she did it. She found the courage to do it, and transformed by the implications of her own research, Sister Thiering became an important educator in the field. She served with Monsignor John Osterreicher at the Center for Judeo-Christian Studies at Seton Hall University. She was a lively activist on behalf of Israel and led over 50 study tours to the Jewish state. And last but certainly not least, she was my friend and my colleague. And I have to say, I could not have done this document that I submitted to Cardinal Bea without her research. When I first began reading the raw data from the Protestant and Catholic textbooks, I was astonished both at the degree of hostility to Jews and Judaism and at the extent of group libel that I found in many of the excerpts. I'm recalling a few of them here, just these statements, to remind us of the dimensions of the problems that we uncovered. This is a quote from these are quotations from a few Catholic textbooks. 1, his prophecy was partially fulfilled in the destruction of Jerusalem and more fully in the rejection by God of the chosen people. Another quote, Christ, by his miracles and preaching, tried to conquer the obstinacy of the Jews and to bring them to repentance. The Jews, on the contrary, by the bad influence of their hypocrisy and pride, hindered the spread of the knowledge of God among the nations. I wonder if whoever wrote that commentary, did he remember Matthew's accusation that a Pharisee would, quote, cross land and sea to make one disciple? Israel's mission is precisely to spread the knowledge of one God among the nations, not to make everybody Jewish, but to have everybody affirm one God, the creator and redeemer. And last but not least, quote, the Jews as a nation refused to accept Christ, and since his time, they have been wanderers on the earth without a temple or a sacrifice and without the Messiah. And I was particularly struck by this passage because it was so similar to a Protestant lesson, which I quote. Israel rejected their Messiah when he came, and because of their failure, they withered away. This has been Israel's condition as a nation for centuries. She has dried up with no national symbols such as a land, a king, a flag. Now, the interesting thing is that both of these comments were published years after the emergence of the modern state of Israel. The Protestant textbook comment was 14 years later, and they are striking instances of history of reality trumped by theology. If the theological proposition is that the Jews' loss of national sovereignty, their dispersion and subsequent suffering and persecution are providential punishment for the crime of killing and or rejecting Jesus, then clearly the state of Israel can have no validity. It contradicts the theological conviction of permanent Jewish dispersion. Therefore, by definition, Israel is a spiritual impostor. Now, whether this theological presupposition carries over into political judgments on Israel's behavior is not our subject here today. It's a question worthy of another conference, and I would like a seat at the table at that one. Now, look, I mean, these were not the only kinds of references to Jews and Judaism in the textbooks. There were neutral or fair statements as well. But what struck me about the examples I have cited was the vehemence, the intensity with which any sense of continuing mission for Judaism, any meaningful witness for the Jewish people, except witnessing to the superior truth of Christianity, any validity in Jewish terms for the recreation of a Jewish commonwealth in Israel, were dismissed a priori. And these teachings certainly qualify as teachings of contempt. The documents submitted to Cardinal Bea incorporated such examples, which were unearthed in Sister Rosa's research. But the organization, the arguments, the call for the forthcoming council to repudiate such teachings were my own. I was not bound by the rules and regulations that constrained her, for she could not evaluate as negative any statement about Jews and Judaism, no matter how disparaging, that was considered church doctrine at the time. She couldn't call it a doctrinal statement by the church negative in her doctorate. So I take authorship of the document I wrote, but I couldn't have written it without Sister Rosa's research, and I want to make that support that claim. And Bea had a very good reaction to it, and he wanted to see more scholarly material. You know, he wanted to see stuff. We later had to submit textbook material from European textbooks as well. And there were studies done at Louvain University in Belgium on French language textbooks, at Prodeo University on Italian, and these findings, which believe it or not, showed the American textbooks to be better, were forwarded to him as well. And on November 17th, 1961, again, before the opening of the council, a second memorandum, Anti-Jewish Elements in Catholic Liturgy, was submitted to Bea. While acknowledging the recent deletion of problematic passage in the literature, the document noted that the concept of Jews as deicides still figured in some liturgical passages in popular and scholarly commentaries on the liturgy and in homiletic literature. And that document was prepared for us by Dr. Eric Werner, who was a liturgist and a musicologist at Hebrew Union College. And when he came in with the document and put it on my desk, the entire thing was in Latin. And I remember I said to Dr. Werner, I said, the American Jewish Committee can't send the document. You know, we can't submit a document to the Vatican Council in Latin. It has to be in English. And he said, well, okay, but they'll never take you seriously. we did have some laughs. And in December 1961, Rabbi Tannenbaum arranged for Professor Abraham Joshua Heschel to meet with Cardinal Bea in Rome. Tannenbaum intuited that these two would get along. I mean, Heschel was, who had been, by the way, Mark's teacher at Jewish Theological Seminary, was, in his words, a towering figure in American Jewish scholarship. He was like the 15th generation of Hasidic masters. He probably knew every word of the Talmud and the Bible by heart. And Bea was himself a biblical scholar, and they met. There's a wonderful picture, which I don't have at my disposal, of the two of them huddled over a text. Unfortunately, Mark Tannenbaum's picture in the background was largely obscured. But anyway, Bea invited Heschel to submit suggestions for positive council action to improve Catholic-Jewish relations. And in May 1962, he followed up with a memorandum recommending a number of specific actions. Forthright rejection of the deicide charge, recognition of Jews as Jews rather than as potential converts, and promotion of scholarly and civic cooperation and the creation of church agencies to help overcome religious prejudice. I have to say that there was some resistance from fellow Jews to these initiatives. There were naysayers who claimed that the church was, by its very nature, anti-Semitic, and that efforts to change it were futile and demeaning. One rabbi told me, Esau will always hate Jacob. Others argued that anti-Semitism was a Christian problem. Let the Christians solve it. To which we responded with the language of the civil rights movement. Racism may be a white problem, but should that prevent the Black community from addressing it and confronting it? But resistance within the Jewish community was nothing compared to the vehemence and hostility that the so-called Jewish Declaration engendered, both inside and outside the deliberations of the Vatican Council. The objections to a positive statement about Jews and Judaism came basically from two sources. One were the theological conservatives, or I might say reactionaries within the church, and secondarily from Arab governments and religious leaders. Now, the Arab opposition to any statement expressing esteem or affection for Jews, suggesting a special relationship between Christianity and the Jewish people, deploring specific acts of persecution against Jews, and removing a theological basis of anti-Semitism, didn't come from Muslim writings. I mean, that didn't come from the Quran. That was politically motivated. But Christian theological categories were enlisted in this campaign, which was carried out on the highest political and diplomatic levels. Indeed, the campaign included several diplomatic démarches to the Holy See and threats of reprisals against Christian minorities in Arab lands. And then, of course, in addition to the Arab initiatives, there was a sustained campaign against the so-called Jewish Declaration on doctrinal grounds by conservative elements within the church who believed that the Jews as a people did indeed bear collective responsibility as deicides, and that their suffering across the ages was proof of providential punishment. I believe they didn't take into account that some of this suffering across the ages was caused by church legislation itself. Now, representatives of this position may have constituted only a small minority within the council, but they had access to extraordinary channels of distribution. Thus, a few days before the conclusion of the second session of the council, every prelate found in his mailbox a privately printed 900-page volume Il complotto contra la Chiesa, the plot against the church, filled with the most primitive anti-Semitism. It was described by Monsignor George Higgins, who at that time was a columnist for the National Catholic Welfare Conference's press service, as, quote, a sickening diatribe against the Jews. And it charged that there was a Jewish fifth column among the Catholic clergy plotting against the church, and it even justified Hitler's acts against the Jews. And it's interesting, the fifth column accusation was undoubtedly directed at converts from Judaism who were associated with Bea's secretariat and who played some role in drafting the declarations, such as Father Gregory Baum and Monsignor John Osterreicher, both of whom had written widely on issues of Jewish-Christian relations. These and others, such as Edith Stein, were faithful Catholics, serious scholars who found their religious fulfillment in Christianity, but who also realized that Judaism was being defamed, distorted, and maligned by blind hatred. During the second session, another anti-Semitic publication was privately distributed to the Council Fathers. The English title, I don't have it in Italian. The Jews and the Council in Light of Scripture and Tradition. It cited Catholic sources supporting the God-killing charges, proclaimed that Jews could only wipe out the curse upon them by converting to Christianity, and insisted that the efforts to change the traditional view that were a result of a conspiracy in the council by Jews and Freemasons working on behalf of communism. And I think our homegrown anti-Semite, Gerald L.K. Smith, offered to translate this document, or the first one, and make it available to Americans in general. Revisiting the paranoia of the ultra-right and the fierce opposition of the Arab world, it is perhaps remarkable that any positive statement made it through the gamut at all. But it was almost scuttled, and its fate was tied to a roller coaster for the duration of the council. It was not introduced into the second session of the council at all. A weakened version of the statement was introduced in the third session, including language that seemed to imply that respect for Jews was motivated by missionary interest and contingent upon Jewish conversion. Obviously, that didn't sit well with the Jewish community. Rabbi Heschel called it, quote, spiritual fratricide, unquote, and stated that faced with the alternative between conversion and death, he would choose Auschwitz. But it also angered some major American and European Catholic leaders who raised their voices in support of a clear and forthright statement. And I should add here that the American hierarchy really found its voice about this time. You know, the American hierarchy, when the council started, or before the council even started, sort of was looked down on by elements in the Curia who thought the Americans were rather primitive. They weren't that fluent in Latin. The wonderful cardinal of Boston, name slipped me, said that if the deliberations were going to be carried on in Latin at the Vatican Council, he would represent the Church of Silence. And but the Americans suddenly woke up and realized, wait a minute, our Catholics go to church, and that many of the elements in the Curia who were putting them down, you know, represented communities where 4 or 5% of Catholics went to church. So they exercised their privilege in support of this document. The battered and bruised Declaration on the Jews, promulgated by Paul VI as Nostra Aetate, was adopted at the council on its final day, along with the Declaration on Religious Liberty. Both had survived determined assaults, were weakened in their final form, and were, to a certain extent, compromised documents. But both changed the relationship between Christians and Jews irretrievably. Some of the follow-up documents adopted both by the Holy See and by national bishops' councils around the world have expanded and strengthened it. Some appear to have backtracked or retreated. There have been many bumps along the way, some setbacks and misunderstandings. In an American Jewish Yearbook article in 1966, I predicted that it would be implemented least where it was needed the most. And that seems to be the case. And I must also note, sadly, that the entire arsenal of Christian anti-Judaism, particularly the blood libel, now thoroughly repudiated by contemporary church communions, has been appropriated by Muslim extremists, and I stress extremists, not the whole Muslim world, as a political weapon. To wit, a former Jordanian MP claimed on a television interview that Jews use the blood of Christian children to make matzah. I quote, "On their religious holidays, if they cannot find a Muslim to slaughter and use drops of his blood to knead the matzahs they eat, they slaughter a Christian in order to take drops of his blood and mix it into the matzahs they eat on that holiday." Alas, this belief is not exceptional in the Arab Middle East. Egyptian national television broadcast a multi-segment series based on the protocols of the Elders of Zion, a fabrication of the Tsarist secret police, but incorporating most of the anti-Semitic imagery current in Christian polemic at the time. I saw one of those segments with my own eyes. In it, Jews capture a young Christian boy, place him in a barrel, pierce his veins, draw the blood, and the rabbi rubs his hands together and tells the group the matzahs will taste particularly delicious this Passover. I have to say it made me sick to my stomach. At the time, I thought it was an Egyptian production and limited to that audience. But Professor Reuben Firestone, a scholar, a defender of Islam, a friend of the Muslim community, told me that the series was produced in Syria and has been distributed throughout the Muslim world. Hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of Muslims in Indonesia and Malaysia who have never met a Jew now believe this of Judaism. It has done, he said, incalculable harm. Now, I want to add to that, there are very recent movements within the Muslim world to begin dialogue to reject this anti-Semitism, to find ways to relate on a religious basis and to fight prejudice. And I want to express appreciation for David Rosen, who has been a leader in that effort. But the political use of anti-Semitism as a weapon against Israel is still very current in the Arab world. Nevertheless, I have to say, out of that historic council 50 years ago has emerged a group of Christians and Jews, Catholics, Protestants, others, religious leaders, scholars, activists, and ordinary citizens, committed to mutual respect and understanding, to overcoming the sources of bigotry and discrimination in our own religious traditions, to making this world a saner and safer place for our children. We have come a long way. We have a long way to go. I pray that we may follow this path together. Thank you.
Thank you, Judith, so much. It goes without saying that I'm so glad this is being recorded, because I know myself, I'm going to want to go back and not only for myself, but also for my students. So wonderful. Thank you so much for taking us through this historic and important journey and personal journey as well. There's a number of questions on chat, and I'll get to those, and also others can ask, as it were, in person. But can you just say briefly, just like, how did you get into this? Like, how did you find yourself in the path that you did? What led you to that road? Because if you said to me, a Jewish woman at this time, would she be involved in X? I would say the percentage is very low. So why? How did this happen?
Accidentally. I will tell you the truth. In 1955, I went up to the Anti-Defamation League for a position in their publications department. I mean, my background was also writing, editing, copy editing, etc. And they needed they had advertised that they wanted somebody in the publications department. And I was interviewed by now you have to remember, in 1955, they didn't have computers. There was no such thing as desktop publishing. So you had to go to a publishing company and you had to know the routine, you know, first galleys, final sheets. And I didn't have that knowledge. So the man who interviewed me, who had recently come from Chicago to head up the publications department, said, you have the writing and editing skills, but I need somebody who knows the publishing houses in New York City. And I admitted I didn't. He said, but there's another opening here for somebody who has those skills. And let me introduce you to the rabbi. So as soon as he said rabbi, I pushed back. My idea of a rabbi, which you know, was somebody bent over with a long beard, and I didn't think I wanted to work for one. I was not. I mean, I was a member of a Reform congregation, but I didn't know. And then inbounds this 31-year-old, open-hearted, wonderful young man named Rabbi Arthur Gilbert. And he was starting a brand new department called the Department of Interreligious Cooperation. And I said to him, well, what does the job involve? He said, well, it involves reaching out to the Christian community, Protestant and Catholic, trying to establish an ongoing dialogue, trying to get the church to look at its own teachings about Jews and Judaism and where they're inaccurate or negative to correct them, and trying to give them information about, you know, to correct their stereotypes about Jewish living today. So I said, well, it sounds like wonderful work, but it's not for me. And he said, why not? And I said, I have no experience in this field. And he said to me, my dear young lady, in 1955, I was a young lady. He said, and my dear young lady, there is no field. And that's the point. Now there is a field. Now there is a conference of centers on Jewish-Christian relations. Now there are courses in advanced Jewish-Christian studies in any number of academic institutions. Interestingly, probably most of them Catholic, but some of them Protestant, some of them Jewish. And now I think if I were going for a position in the world of Christian-Jewish relations today, I wouldn't get it. I'm not qualified. I'm not a cleric. I'm not a rabbi. I'm not an academic. And I stumbled into the field. And I think I have survived in the field and helped form it and helped shape it and helped direct it, because I had an open mind and an open heart, and a desire to defend my people, and a willingness to learn about Christianity, and a willingness to learn about Judaism, which I learned about as I progressed in this work. And you know, and that's how I got into it. And now it is led by people a great deal more qualified than I. I see in the audience Sister Mary Boyce, who is one of my great heroes. Mary and another colleague were the first Catholics ever hired by what was considered the premier Protestant seminary in the United States of America, the Union Theological Seminary. And I think now Mary is the academic advisor for Union Theological Seminary. And she also teaches at Jewish Theological Seminary. And that's something that's a new development. And co-teaching, teaching of Jews and Christians together on a particular subject is something I always dreamed of and promoted. They have that at St. Joseph's, where Phil Cunningham and Adam Brigham teach courses on Jewish-Christian relations together. And that's, I think, a very important way of overcoming distortions and stereotypes. So that's how I got into the field, and I'm still in it. So.
Thank you. There's a number of questions here in chat. Let me just first note that anytime somebody has both humility, so quick to give credit to other people, which we've seen throughout your talk, even though you deserve a lot of credit, and of course humor, you know you're in the presence of somebody with great wisdom. I just needed to at least point that out. Let me get to this first question from Anne. Given the texts in the Catholic Bible, so I'm assuming you know Christian scriptures, do you think that we, and I assume you mean Catholics here, but correct me if I'm wrong, have a better relationship with the Jewish community today, or is this hatred in quotes almost still evident and hindering interreligious dialogue? So I guess Anne's question is, where do you think things stand today between, I guess, specifically Catholics and Jews? Are you hopeful? How would you take a position today versus the past?
Well, I have to answer that in two ways. First of all, we didn't critique the Bible. You know, the Bible is sacred literature. We may not like some stuff in it. I mean, I don't like Matthew 25:27, his blood be us and on our children. But we don't ask of Christians to change their Bible. We ask them to look at some of the negative sections of the Bible and explain them, and put them in a historical context to take the poison out of them. But nobody is out to and of course, don't forget, this was 50, 60 years ago we started this. You don't try to censor somebody else's sacred literature. But textbooks are not the Bible. And Dr. Olson pointed out in biblical interpretation in the textbooks, he says, a point of view is brought to scripture as well as derived from it. And he said, and he noted in the Protestant textbooks that he studied, that some textbook writers increased the negativity that was in the biblical section, and other textbook writers tried to explain it and diffuse it. So we were dealing with teaching materials, we were dealing with textbooks. Textbooks can be changed, textbooks can be adopted. And Roman Catholic textbooks in the United States, and I think in Europe, have changed. I don't think any Roman Catholic textbook still talks about Jews as God killers. I'm not sure if I can speak for the Protestant world. I mean, there has been an increase in anti-Semitism, as we all know, in the last few years. Vehement anti-Semitism, violent anti-Semitism. And some of it does come from religious extremists, and there's a good deal of religious paranoia there about, Jews and Judaism. The circulation of probably the most successful anti-Semitic publication ever issued, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which claim that there's a secret plot among Jews to control the world, and that was evident in the attacks on the Pittsburgh synagogue. I mean, the ancient canards are still with us, but they are not entirely or even essentially biblical. They're interpretations of the Bible. They're negative and hostile interpretations of the Bible.
Thanks. Joy would like to know, can you speak more about the role of Catholic converts from Judaism in Vatican II, such as Gregory Baum or others?
Well, I mean, I knew Gregory, but as a matter of fact, I went to hear Tom Stransky talk when he spoke at Seton Hall. And at that point, he said, there are only 3 people still alive, who played some active role in promoting Nostra Aetate, and they're all here tonight. And the other one was Gregory Baum, so I did meet him. But I mean, all I know about these people is that they weren't fake Christians; they were authentic Christians, just as Edith Stein was an authentic Christian, and her conversion was sincere. But the point is still, the Nazis put her to death as a Jew, not as a Catholic nun, but as a Jew. She died because she was born a Jew, not because she was a Catholic nun. Her sister was also converted and was also killed by the Nazis. So, but the point is, they were not the anti-Semites. There were, during the medieval period, Jews who converted to Christianity and became the leaders of the forced debates, made very bad, probably caused a lot of deaths and deaths at the stake by claiming negative comments about the Talmud and Jewish teachings. But I'm talking about in the modern period. The Jewish converts to Christianity, or people who had whose family going back generations had converted to Christianity, and they were authentic Christians. They weren't Jews. They were authentic Christians, but they obviously knew enough about Judaism to know that it was being distorted and maligned.
Lillian wants to know, and this is, I guess, the context of the growth of interreligious dialogue beyond just the Jewish-Christian one. And so she asks, how do we maintain the story of the unique bond between Judaism and Christianity in the context of a larger and newer interest of interreligious dialogue?
I think it's a very important question. It's a very important question. The International Council of Christians and Jews, something like, I think, 15 years ago, decided that it was time to reach out to the Islamic community and to bring Muslims into the dialogue. And they invited Muslims, and the Muslims said, and their response was, it was quite understandable. Well, in that case, you're going to have to change your title. So it's not going to be the Council of Christians and Jews, it's going to be the Council of Christians and Jews and Muslims. And the ICCJ sent out a questionnaire to all of their membership organizations to ask, should we do this? Should we change our title? I think the questionnaire went around for over a year, and it was very interesting. And the decision that came back was, no, we should not change our title because there are issues that are just Christian Jewish issues that have to deal with, we have a common scripture. We have a lot of division and problems over interpretation of that common scripture. And we should not dissolve what are essentially Christian Jewish issues and Christian Jewish problems. We have to keep focusing on that. At the same time, what the ICCJ did was it developed another outreach program called the Abrahamic Forum. The Abrahamic Forum has been tri-faith from the beginning, and it includes Muslims, and it meets, the Abraham Forum meets when the ICCJ meets, generally before, and its members are invited to sit in on the ICCJ meetings. But the point is that there are tri-faith issues and there are two faith issues. And probably there are Muslim Jewish issues that have to be discussed also. Um, another department heard from, but I think there is something very special about the Jewish-Christian relationship, because most Jews, I mean, many Jews did live under Islam, and they lived under Islam probably better than they lived under Christianity in the medieval period and the period of the Crusades. But most Jews interacted with Christians, lived in Christian Europe. And, after the Shoah, when Christians of good conscience woke up and said, how could this disaster, this genocide have happened in nations of Christian culture, and had to come to the conclusion that maybe because they were nations of Christian culture, that had something to do with it. And that, that really did spark a kind of what I would call a kind of spiritual self-examination and house cleaning in the Christian world, and with, again, in connection and in collaboration with Jewish scholars. So the ICC didn't want to lose that special aspect that it has, and at the same time reach out inclusively to Muslims and then managing both.
We have a number of other questions. Are you okay for another 10 or 15 minutes? We won't be able to get to every question, but it's okay if I still hammer you with a couple more questions from the group. Is that all right?
I'm okay if you don't mind my sipping my coffee.
No, of course. You definitely need a pause and a break. You've been doing all the work, and we're just sitting and relaxing and taking in your answers and knowledge. Das would, I guess, with Nostra Aetate, of course, the focus is on, for many, Catholicism. So Das would like to know, are there any challenges today in terms of Judaism and Protestant tradition? And obviously that's very diverse, but so not just Catholics, but maybe what has been your experience with other Christians, let's say, in terms of Jewish-Christian dialogue?
Well, because there's a huge range in Protestantism. I mean, when Olson started his work, he started reading the curriculum materials of the 32 member Protestant denominations of the National Council of Churches, and he realized it was impossible. There was no way he could study 32 different denominations textbooks. So his approach to that was to settle on 4 different theological positions within Protestantism. One of them was fundamentalism, and he looked at the materials of the Southern Baptist Convention. One of them was conservatism, and I think, and he used one of the presses, one of the publications for that. One of them was liberalism. One of them was liberalism, and he used the materials of the Unitarian Universalist people, and one was sort of classical reform for Presbyterian outlooks. And he analyzed those 4 different theological positions. And he was able to find that the most hostility to the Jews came from the conservative. I think it was Scripture Press, and he was even able to find that one man who wrote the textbooks for that, one author of the textbook materials brought the most negative statements about Jews and Judaism to everything he wrote. So that's when he said, if there's prejudice in the writer, there's going to be prejudice in the biblical interpretations. But different. I'll give you an illustration of some of the differences. When one of the first, I think the very first project I got when I came to AJC in addition to looking at the textbook findings, was to do an analysis of the Christian press reaction, Protestant and Catholic, to the Eichmann trial as it was going on. And there it was very interesting distinctions. The Protestants were much more worried about what Israel was going to do to Eichmann than they were worried about what Eichmann did to the Jews. In other words, all they focused on was that the trial was illegitimate, that Israel had no right to conduct the trial, and then they pleaded for mercy on Israel's behalf, that Israel shouldn't kill Eichmann. They never looked at the issue of anti-Semitism. They ignored the issue of anti-Semitism. They dealt with the legalism of the trial. A lot of the Protestant press, certainly the so-called liberal Protestants. The Catholics were less interested in the outcome of, and whether Eichmann was going to die or not. Catholics focused on the Catholics who saved Jews and Judaism. In other words, they were trying to protect their own record. And don't forget, this was in 1961. It was before Vatican II. So, but the best single response to the Eichmann trial that came out of all of the religious commentaries was written by James O'Gara of Commonweal. And I don't have it in front of me, but he basically said, you have to look at the realities, what was done. He said that the gas chambers disguised as showers, the effort to destroy every Jew on the face of the earth. That was the important, and we Catholics have to look at what might have been within us that made that possible. And you didn't get that so much from the Protestants. And also there was a hostility to Israel in some of the Protestant communities. Still is, I think.
Fascinating. I mean, I could ask a million questions just about the Eichmann trial. It's amazing. Let me move on though. Get some other people. Celia, of course, knows a lot about this area as well. But what has it been like to be a woman in an area that until relatively recently was dominated by men?
Not easy. Not easy. I mean, the first day I came to work at AJC, I bumped into somebody in the hall. He said, "Oh, you know the person in the Interreligious Affairs department?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "Of course, a woman can't do this job." That was what he said to me. And, I mean, it is true. Certainly, there was a mechanism set up for the church to meet with the Jewish community after the Second Vatican Council, and I was finally invited to give a paper at one Vatican Jewish conference, and I looked around, and the clergy were all male. Of course, the clergy were all male. There was a Sister of Zion there. I called the Sisters of Zion my secret army. I don't know what we would do without them, But among the men also, many Orthodox rabbis, some conservative rabbis, some Reform rabbis, very, very few women. I must say there is an Orthodox laywoman who's been at those meetings. But I remember not only did I gave a paper at that conference, but I was very helpful in editing the Jewish statement. They read out a statement at the end, and I made a lot of editorial suggestions. And I remember the people who were handling the comments said, "Gee, we have to have more women at our meetings." I was never invited to another meeting. I was never invited to another Vatican Jewish meeting. And of course, since I left AJC, I don't have the institutional connection. If somebody is going to recommend me, it has to be from the outside. But yes, I mean, I did encounter a lot of not so much hostility as a woman, but the feeling that a woman couldn't do this work. And I guess I just responded by doing the work. And, you know, it isn't so much that I consider myself an active feminist, you know, but you can't help but be a feminist when you're told that a woman can't do this work. So, and I was also an early proponent of interreligious dialogue among women. And we had my colleague at AJC, Inga Lederer-Gabel, who was very much a feminist, started a women's interreligious dialogue group. And we were, I think, the first to have a Muslim participant. And she was a Muslim feminist. So, yeah, I mean, I bonded with other women, and then I bonded with people with whom I shared an intellectual legacy, Christian and Jewish.
Just because of time, we'll maybe end on this one question. And again, my apologies to those who I wasn't able to read your question off. This is it. Do you have any advice for young people looking to enter the interfaith field? So, and again, there'll be many students in the audience and others. This will be recorded, so there'll be people listening weeks, days, years, maybe decades later. What kind of advice would you give to people who want to enter this interfaith field?
Well, I think I would rather have somebody else answer that. But I mean, my first advice would be to look for a university or a college that gives courses in that field. I mean, there were many in the Catholic tradition, there are a number in the Protestant field. In rabbinical schools, they're now teaching Christian-Jewish relations. I would read the literature, you know. You have literature, I have literature. There are recommendations. The ICCJ has all kinds of reading